Now we'll start off in the GCP console. Let's go to the home screen and select our project name. We'll use this later. Now let's go to the storage browser and create a new bucket. We're going to name this bucket after our GCP project. We'll accept all the defaults. Now let's create a virtual machine instance. We'll click the Create Instance button, and we're going to change the name of the VM to First VM. Let's run it in the US Central 1C zone. Let's compare some of the prices of machine types. The micro type is very inexpensive. We'll take almost all the other defaults, except we're going to configure the firewall to allow HTTP traffic through. Now we click Create. It takes a few minutes to create the virtual machine. Once the virtual machine has been created, let's perform a different task. We're going to make a service account. We click Create Service Account and give the account a name. When we click Create, we get the opportunity to define a role for the account. We'll give this one the editor role. A key allows actors to authenticate as this service account. It's downloaded to our local computer. We'll re-upload it later in the lab. Now that the account has been created, it shows up in the list. Next, let's explore Cloud Shell. Cloud Shell gives us an environment where we can use the gcloud command and other cloud commands from the gcloud SDK. We're already authenticated. Our first task is to define some environment variables for convenience. It's not required, but it helps us avoid error. We're defining myBucketName1 to be the same as our GCS bucket that we created earlier, which is named after our project. We'll create another name for a bucket by using that name with a -2 appended to it. We'll echo the contents of that environment variable to make sure it worked. I'm going to full screen the Cloud Shell window and upload the JSON credentials file. It's underneath the three-dot menu. Let's check to make sure it worked. There it is. The file's been successfully uploaded. We'll use it later in the lab. Let's use the gsutil command to make a second cloud storage bucket. gsutil mb does the job. It's created. When we go back to the storage browser, we'll see both the new bucket and the old one in the list. The old one first and then the new one. Let's return to Cloud Shell and make a second virtual machine instance, this time using the command line. Again, to save ourselves the risk of error, we're going to use environment variables. We'll define an environment variable to contain our chosen region. Now let's search for the zones in that region. Looks like the US Central 1 region has 4 zones. For this VM, we're going to choose the A zone. We'll use the gcloud command to define our preferred zone. And we'll put our preferred name for our virtual machine into another environment variable for tidiness. Here's the gcloud command to create a virtual machine from the command line. As always, it takes a moment to complete. Now that it's done, we can see it in the output of the gcloud compute instances list command, as well as in the GCP console. In the compute engine's VM instances list, we see first VM and second VM. There's also a VM here that is an artifact of the QuickLabs environment that you won't see in your own projects. Let's see how to create a service account from the command line. Let's go to the GCP console now and see our newly created service account in the list. Under IAM and Admin, we go to Service Accounts and scroll down. And there it is. Now we're going to use the command line to give the second service account the project viewer role. Done. We can go into the GCP console and confirm the effect of our action. We click on IAM and scroll down in the list of members to find the newly created service account. It's last in alphabetical order. We click the pencil icon, and that reveals that it has the viewer role. Now let's work with Cloud Shell. This command copies a picture of a cat out of a publicly available cloud storage bucket into our Cloud Shell folder. Now we're going to copy that file into our first storage bucket. Now we're going to copy it from one storage bucket to another. All of these were done using the gsutil-cp command. Now each of our 2 buckets has a copy of this picture of a cat. Using the gsutil-acl command, we're going to configure the first bucket so that it is private to only its owner. We can see the effect of this change by changing who we're authenticated as. The gcloud config list command shows us that presently the account we're authenticated as is GCP staging 57838 student at quicklabs.net. Let's change that. Now we're going to assume the role of a service account, the first one we created. Notice that we used the credentials file that we previously uploaded. The gcloud config list command confirms the change as effect. Notice the account now is shown as our service account. Now when we try to copy the cat picture into the first storage bucket, we get an access denied exception because it is private to the owner and we are the service account now instead of the owner. We can copy the image into the second bucket because we didn't change its permissions. Let's change who we're authenticated as back to our GCP account. We'll use the gcloud config command just like before. Now let's repeat our attempt to copy the cat picture into the bucket. It succeeds because we own the bucket. Now let's configure that bucket so that its contents are public. Now when we look at the bucket using the storage browser of the GCP console, we'll notice something new. We'll drill into that bucket, and there we will see that there's a public link for the cat picture. We'll open it in a new tab, and we see a picture of a cat. We'll use this in a web page. Remember, we configured a virtual machine earlier and opened its firewall port for HTTP. We'll create the web page using the Cloud Shell code editor, which you can launch by clicking the pencil icon. Let's explore the Code Shell editor first. First, let's experiment with what happens when we change the contents of our Cloud Shell home directory. We're going to clone a Git repository in. Notice that the change is immediately reflected in the file display. When I create a directory from the command line, that change is reflected immediately too. Let's open up one of these directories and open a file. Here's the file cleanup.sh. I'm going to add a new line at the very end of this file. The change is immediately visible from the command line. I'm going to cat the file, and there's the line I added. Now let's go make that HTML page. I'm going to return to the home directory and my shell prompt. Then I'm going to go to the file menu of the editor and create a file called index.html. I'm going to paste in some web page text. And I'm going to replace the URL with the actual URL of the copy of the cat picture that I put into my public cloud storage bucket. Now I'm going to copy that file out of Cloud Shell into my virtual machine. We need to install web server software into our virtual machine, so we're going to SSH to it using the link that's provided for us in the VM instances display. We'll use the standard Debian Linux commands to install the Nginx web server. Now that that's done, let's return to Cloud Shell and move our HTML file in using SCP. Oh, I know why that didn't work. I put the file into the wrong directory. I'm going to use Cloud Shell's editor to drag it into the right place, into my home directory. Now the command will work. The file is copied to my virtual machine. I return to my SSH window on the VM and move that HTML file from the home directory to Nginx's document root. Now I can go to the VM instances screen and click the link, and I get the web page that I created.